Today I'm going to talk about the business case for responsive design. I'm not going to be talking about how to build responsive design, but rather the why of responsive design. There are many ideas out there about the best way to implement responsive designs, so I want to focus on how responsive design can positively impact the bottom line. We all have our opinions about responsive design. We have some good feelings about it, we have some bad feelings about it, but there are a few things that we do know about responsive design. We know that responsive design allows us to meet the customer on their terms. Instead of forcing a user into a desktop browser, responsive design allows us to interact with them however and whenever they need us. Because of this, we know that responsive design is helping us create better experiences for our customers. The methodologies of responsive design are forcing us to focus on the things that matter most to customers, which is content and features. We're sort of free to divorce ourselves from adding extra fluff to our apps without the data that shows it being useful to our customers. We also know that responsive design doesn't anger our users. When a website or web app is participating in activities that sort of anger customers, they usually stop visiting and share their experience with other customers, typically by building tumblers of the specific experience failings. And in this example, you can see that there are some apps that have built either separate mobile apps or native apps, and they won't allow you to view their content unless you download those apps. So one hidden trick to sort of not anger users is keeping in mind that every asset that you send to a mobile device is actually costing users money. It's been roughly calculated that for every 1 kilobyte you send, you're costing your users a tiny fraction of a penny. This number seems sort of small, but if you're serving up a 300 kilobyte web page, that's about 2.5 cents per visit. So this can add up quickly depending on the size of your site. You also have to remember that assets like third-party ads and libraries need to be accounted for. So some of the optimizations that we can utilize to sort of reduce this is by using media queries and polyfills. Media queries are CSS based and are the backbone of responsive design on the front end. Polyfills are JavaScript based and can help us serve assets based on the size and bandwidth constraints of the device. They can also help us serve the proper assets to Retina devices as well. Another thing we can do is we can lazy load content where possible. So, for example, hiding content at the bottom of the page until the user actually scrolls to the bottom of the page. So this does add up to extra costs for responsive design. It's really hard to sort of define how much it's going to cost, and if anybody ever asks me, I typically give them Brad Frost's answer, which was $13.47. So the extra costs for responsive design are wholly dependent on the project. Some of those extra costs are going to be time to resolve design questions. So you can mock up, sketch, or wireframe multiple times, but occasionally things just don't work right on an actual device. It will take some extra time to sort of account for these design tweaks. You're also going to need extra time to build out the front end of your site. Responsive design sort of requires some extra care and feeding to be done correctly so that we're not serving massive images to mobile devices over slow bandwidth connections. There's also going to be some extra time required to develop the back end. This may come through building out better caching or building better sort of right-sized image handling. Testing responsive design is definitely going to be an extra expense because you're no longer just testing across a couple browsers on Mac and Windows. You're now testing against 20 to 30 different devices on top of the normal desktop devices or desktop browsers. So it's a pretty easy question to ask, is responsive design worth it? And the short answer is yes. So let's take a better look at that. So developers sort of know that responsive design is a best practice that we should all be using nowadays. Responsive design isn't just focused on the size of a device. It also takes into account bandwidth constraints of device, sort of context of the device. So if I'm working at some remote location with very slow internet connection, I still want the web to work very fast. So, but managers typically they don't really care about this unless it's going to improve the bottom line and provide a good return on investment. So when we're doing trainings and talking to other developers, the number one question that we get asked is, how can I convince my boss that we should be using responsive design? So the easiest answer is because Forbes says so. They recently posted an article that basically explained to businesses why they should be prioritizing responsive design. This probably isn't going to work as easily as we think it is. So there is still sort of a gap between developers and managers. Thankfully, this gap is pretty easy to bridge between the two as we look at more and more of the data. So we're going to start by looking at the intangibles of responsive design. So responsive design makes everyone happy. Developers love it, customers love it, Google loves it, other search engines love it. So let's start with the customers. So when you have happy customers, you have more money. They shop more, they visit more, they hang out more. Whatever your business model is, they're going to do it more. Responsive design is also Google's official way to support mobile devices and provide sort of a boost to your SEO. And this may hold true for Bing and Yahoo, but there's not enough data to prove that. But with Google, we know that they prefer responsive design because they say so right in their webmaster guidelines. Responsive design also provides us a way to gracefully degrade to browsers that just can't handle responsive design. And it's a good way to support browsers like IE8. Responsive design makes developers happy, or at least more interested, as it is still fairly new and many challenges are not solved with responsive design. And this can help it reduce employee churn. So what about separate mobile sites? So separate mobile sites tend to be less user-friendly. This could be because it's attempting to sort of assume user context and blocks access to content and features that someone thinks a user might not want on a mobile device, but really they do want that content or that feature. It could also be because most mobile sites tend to really kind of suck at handling requests between the site and the mobile site, which is sort of demonstrated by this semi-famous XKCD comment. Separate mobile sites will typically be cheaper to build, especially if you're using an off-the-shelf framework like jQuery Mobile or something like that. But the cost of maintaining them with separate code bases and different libraries will outweigh the cost of responsive as you add up all the technical debt. The cost of a responsive design actually decreases with each subsequent responsive project that you build. After the first project, as infrastructure and tool sets are built out to help with responsive design, the cost to build and maintain responsive sites decreases. So let's talk about native apps. So it's not entirely the right question to ask, native versus responsive. There's a place for both, and there are a lot of native apps that do things very, very well. So the thing to consider is native apps have websites too, and it's those sites that should be built responsively. Some of them do work on mobile. Some of them don't. So if you go to the Wolfram Alpha for iPhone page, you'll actually get a blank white screen. And I'm pretty sure that's not what the native iPhone developers for Wolfram Alpha were looking for from their marketing site. It's important to remember that responsive design is not a silver bullet that's going to solve all the problems of the web. It's just a best practice for us to be using as developers. So now that we've covered the intangibles, let's take a look at the data for some recent responsive launches. It's this data that can really help managers accept that the added costs are going to provide enough benefit in return. Right now, this data is sort of hard to come by. And if you have any of this data to share with the community, I really urge you to blog it, tweet it, or otherwise share it with us so that we can further this cause. So the first case we're going to look at is O'Neill. O'Neill's a large surf retailer. They had a separate mobile app, and they chose to redesign responsively. And as you can see, their iOS transactions increased greatly, their revenue increased greatly, the Android transactions and revenue went through the roof. These, for a company like O'Neill, who's fairly large, these numbers are massive. The next one we're going to look at is Skinny Ties, who's a little bit smaller than O'Neill, but as you can see, their revenue went up, their iPhone revenue went up, their conversion rate went up, and their bounce rate went down. And the bounce rate is actually very important because the longer users stay on a site, the more likely they are to convert. So that's the sort of the e-commerce side of things. Those are the two biggest examples that we have right now. There are a couple others out there and more being posted all the time. So let's look at some of the content-focused ones. So Time, who's a fairly large publication, they also had a separate mobile web app. By killing that off and releasing a responsive site, they saw their mobile and tablet traffic go up, their unique visits went up, the pages per visit went up, and the bounce rate went down significantly. Now, these numbers are not as large as the e-commerce ones, but you have to remember that Time has a much larger scale, and a 10% increase in mobile or tablet traffic and a 15% increase in unique visits is a huge boost and allows them to sell many more ads, or at least charge more for advertising. The next one we're going to look at is Parents. This is Parents Magazine or Parents.com. After they released their responsive design, their overall traffic went up 118%, and their mobile traffic went up almost 40%. Again, these numbers are still not as big as the e-commerce, but the scale that these companies, the content-based companies, are dealing in is so much bigger than an e-commerce focused site. So the percentages are going to be smaller. You also have to remember that Google tends to get really excited over 0.1% increase in searches on their site. So that's it for the business case of responsive design. If you'd like to learn anything else about responsive design or more about Cantina, feel free to visit us at cantina.co.